Let's do something we haven't done on the channel in a long time. Let's talk about some lore. Let's go back to some Warhammer lore. With the Twisted and the Twilight coming out, I want to talk about three things that I haven't really discussed in depth on the channel. Zoats, Coeddil, and Ghoritch. Three things that we know have been either released, teased, or talked about for the upcoming DLC for Total War Warhammer 2. And the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to talk about Zoats first, then we'll go into Ghoritch because that's not really a huge in-depth portion, and we'll close our video out talking about Coeddil. Now, I'm sure I mispronounced something there and I apologize, but if you want to navigate to each one of these, you can easily jump to it in the timeline. I'm going to have chapters for each location, so you can just go ahead and jump over to it. And lastly, if you have not yet purchased the DLC, you can use the link in my description and in my pinned comment for Nexus. It will allow you to purchase the DLC through there. I also get a commission, and it's a great way to help and support the channel. You'll simply receive a Steam key. They have a nice relationship with Creative Assembly themselves, so they actually get the keys from them and sell them directly to you, and it's a pretty awesome partnership. But let's jump into some fun lore with Zoats, Ghoritch, as well as Coeddil. Opening up our video here on Zoats, I want to go into some of the lore that kind of covers these characters across a lot of different portions of the Games Workshop continuum, right? They were in Warhammer Fantasy, they were in Warhammer Fantasy RPG, we see them in 40k, we see them in Blood Bowl, they're everywhere. And they've had a pretty sordid past. It's been a very interesting character across first, second, and third editions with very interesting inclusions, right? We had a lot of really awkward allied contingents that made their way into some of the earliest portions of Warhammer Fantasy. And we see them kind of disappearing for quite some time until coming back once more in the Storm of Magic. And I think that's where people probably know them the most from the most recent lore, is them coming back in that 8th edition supplement to bring them back into the game. Now we see them full on in the current Games Workshop realm, right? We see them brought into Blackstone Fortress in 40k, and we see them now brought into Blood Bowl as well with Forge World. So one thing I've kind of noticed is that Games Workshop seems to be tying in a lot of their actual model releases with some of their other intellectual properties, mainly with Total War Warhammer, but also with Vermintide and with Warhammer Gladius. Pretty much any way they can kind of couple a model release or something like that, or other kind of announcement with an actual intellectual property that is some sort of video game or something of the sort, they seem to have kind of tied those together. And we just now are getting the Blood Bowl Zoats added in to Warhammer, so now we're getting the Zoats back into Total War Warhammer. So it's a very interesting dichotomy. So what I want to talk about here is now the Storm of Magic lore blurb, and why this is very important for the current Twisted and the Twilight DLC. But there's also something a little bit more under the hood that I think a lot of people have missed and not talked about that I want to go into as well. It's a small short story by C.L. Werner that was a supplement to Storm of Magic. So let's read this real quick lore blurb here. There are few races in the world so mysterious as Zoats. No one knows how they arrived in the forests of the old world, why they did so, or even what their goals are. Are the Zoats a race unto themselves, or some splinter of the Lizardmen? Perhaps the Slann mage priests know, but on this topic, as on so many others, they remain enigmatically silent. Zoats are powerful wizards, able to tap into the winds of magic in an instinctive manner, rather than through study and ritual. Whilst this means that a Zoat will never prove as versatile a wizard as an elf or even a man, their innate control over the life wind Girin surpasses all but the most learned high elf mages. Indeed, many a wood elf spell singer will seek out a Zoat in order to learn from it. But as the elves of Athaloran find Zoats no less elusive than do other beings, very few succeed in their search. In the ordinary run of things, Zoats are seldom encountered outside their woodland homes. Indeed, even within such places, it is rare to catch sight of one. When intruders close or danger threatens, Zoats will rouse the trees and undergrowth to crush and strangle interlopers, rather than take direct action themselves. In this way, Zoats can avoid detection, and even a single such creature can imbue a forest with a reputation so dreadful that even marauding orcs and rampaging war herds will give the area a wide berth. Where sorcery alone is not sufficient, the Zoat will leave the shadows to enter the fray personally. knocking the invaders to the ground with sweeping blows. Once prone, the enemy becomes easy prey for creeping roots and vines, which swiftly entangle and throttle them. When eldritch storms erupt upon the world, it is possible to bind Zoats into service, and only then will the creature leave their reclusive forest homes. So that's from the Storm of Magic supplement that was released. And from that we also get probably the most up-to-date rules for them. A level 3 wizard that can be progressed to level 4. They have access to the lore of life. They're cold-blooded. We get this reptilian creature that has Master of the Vengeful Forest and the Power of the Deep Woods, these 2 abilities that help out with navigating dangerous terrain and with casting spells. And as you will see in the coming days as I release some final information or some actual information from the game with the Zoats, you'll see how this is kind of brought into the game. Total War Warhammer, that is. There is something a little bit deeper here. We get this one interesting passage. Indeed, many a Wood Elf spellsinger will seek out a Zoat in order to learn from it. And that's really the only connection, if you were to look on just the surface, that we get Zoats and Wood Elves allied together, or even in some way, shape, or form, hitting their might together, anything like that. But when we started to kind of take a look through some of the other resources that we have available, like I was talking about that C.L. Werner book, we start to see a little bit more about the Zoats and what they've really done. And from that, we get in this short story, we get some information about actual interactions and conflicts with the Wood Elves and with the Skaven. So this relationship that we have from the downloadable content from the DLC coming out makes a lot of sense as far as their opposition towards one another. So from this book, I want to read a passage about an individual called the Warden of the Wood. Now, this Warden of the Wood is a Zoat, and this individual learning from the Warden of the Wood is a Spellweaver. Spellweavers and spell singers both interchangeably try to learn from Zoats, and they find it it's a little bit of a struggle to find them out, seek them out, and learn from them. So here is a little bit from Ewain, or Urain, but I'm not sure how to pronounce her name 100%, but she says, "He is old and wise," she answered, "older and wiser than elves, or Treeman, or Dryads. He was here before the Oak of Ages. He was here when there was no forest and the gray mountains looked out across a great sea. His time was before anything we know, before anything we could understand. The last survivor of a forgotten race," Thalos whispered in awe, "lingering in the shadows until his time is over." So we get a follow-up to that sentence by Ewain, with Thalos kind of saying, like, kind of echoing that sentiment. So from that, we get this connection of this very deep-rooted, very ancient power in the Zoat, and it's something that harkens back way to the Warhammer 1st and 2nd editions of this very, again, eldritch power that is maybe connected to lizardmen, maybe not. It doesn't really have that full, clear and cut example. It's always kind of been one of those weird races that is very old and is aside the lizardmen in its age, its elder age and wisdom. It's a very interesting kind of dichotomy that it pulls between the two, where it is similar but not really. So it's quite interesting. Now later in this short story, we get the very end of it, and I want to read this portion right here. "An ancient reptile accepted the end of the present danger with cool detachment. It casts its awareness through the forest. At Hawk Heath, the last of the Skaven had been annihilated. The demons called forth by Ewain's desperate spell cast back into the realm of chaos with the sealing of the Golden Pool. The Warden contemplated its fallen acolyte. It had warned the elf, warned that the evil of the pool would seek her through the evil in her own soul. It was a failing of the new races that they could not understand the nature of chaos, would not see the spiritual defects they cherished and called emotion were the feeding grounds for evil. The age of the new races would pass. The wheel of time would run its course. The Warden and its kindred would await the passing of the warm flesh. One day would again be the age of its kind, the age of the Zoats." And at that, we kind of get, again, the little hint here towards the Skaven conflict that we got from Hawk Heath. And we get this discussion about how, or I guess this hinting of how Zoats are this very ancient race that was here before the new races. and it regards elves as a portion of the new races, which it then must include dwarfs, because dwarfs and elves kind of have a very similar timeline. One was awakened before the other, but it doesn't matter because it was still so close. So it doesn't say that Zoats were here before lizardmen, but it does say that it's been here for a very long time, alongside chaos and understanding the nature of chaos. And we get so much about the lore as a Zoat being an individualistic force. So it's interesting to see them in the trailer and everything included as these monstrous cavalry units rather than single entities, is what it looks like. And we'll explore this a little bit later into the week as we get to actually put our hands on them and show them off in some videos. But this is the lore for the Zoats, and I wanted to discuss this a little bit more because everyone has really talked about the Storm of Magic. That has been the biggest thing we've discussed so far with the Zoats, because it's probably the most relevant and most recent source of information. But this this novella is really important because it does create the relationship between the Wood Elves and the Zoats. By the way, the name of the novella is The Hour of Shadows by C.L. Werner. And it also creates a conflict between the Wood Elves and the Skaven that is then kind of makes the Twist in the Twilight make a little bit more sense to me. And on top of it too, it kind of gives you an idea for the breadth of the Zoat and how old and ancient they truly are. Moving away from the Wood Elves, let's come into the Skaven with Ghoritch, Castellan of Hellpit. Now, we already have a representation of this character in a White Dwarf. And in fact, this is the only presence of Ghoritch in the lore for the most part, aside from his minor presence in the End Times and a final aside supplement to the End Times where one of the writers kind of said, hey, here's the results of all the characters we didn't write about. So it's kind of like it's not necessarily a full-on canon entry onto the presence of these characters. But Ghoritch has a pretty cool kit bashed model that I'm going to show you guys here. But you can see Ghoritch in his glory in the trailer right now, and he is pretty badass looking. So I'm excited to talk about him in the coming days here as I can finally lift the embargo and we can go into more detail. But let's go into this lore blurb from the White Dwarf. Ghoritch is Thrott's greatest success in the field of translocation of the brain. Like many who are devoted to the blood god, Ghoritch was once a frenzied berserker who loved the thrill of battle and the tang of fresh blood upon his tongue. He served Archaon throughout the storm of chaos, but the creed of his bloodthirsty god rang strong in his veins, and Ghoritch led a foolhardy attack on an Empire artillery train, despite express orders to the contrary. His tribe were cut down almost to a man. Though Ghoritch slew a score of men that day and lived to tell the tale, Archaon's punishment was swift and inventive. Like many who had failed him, Ghoritch was given to the master mutator of Clan Moulder for their unholy experiments. Even shackled and bound with thorn ropes, Thrott could see Ghoritch was an exceptional stock, and singled him out for the climax of a series of experiments. The experiment was an unparalleled success, translating Ghoritch's mind into the body of a heavily modified rat ogre without driving him mad in the progress. Escaping from Thrott's laboratory, Ghoritch scrambled his way up to the arena at the heart of Hellpit, where he fought off the tide of Thrott's creations sent after him. His skills did not go unnoticed by the master mutators, who recognized his combination of intellect and strength as perfect for controlling the more rebellious of his troops. Ghoritch worked his way into the rank of chieftain and was soon entrusted with the command of Clan Moulder's unique standing army. Thrott is less than pleased at the meteoric rise of his creation and works hard on clandestine schemes to bring about his downfall. So Ghoritch, the Castellan of Clan Moulder, was a pretty interesting model. And again, it was part of the Clan Moulder White Dwarf entry here. So not a huge ton of information on him, and he had a very unceremonious death in the End Times. He was just kind of killed off quick, like, oh, you know, he was here, there, and then he died. Like, nothing cool really ever became of him. But now that we get to see him in Total War Warhammer 2, it's fun to kind of see this character brought to life. And I did want to just very quickly jump into the lore behind him, because we'll be able to actually, like I said before, get our hands on him in the coming days as those embargoes lift, and we can talk about him in full, juicy detail. But let's move on to our last character on our list of lore videos today, lore discussions today, with Coeddil. And you can't talk about Coeddil without talking about the other two Elder Treeman. Now you've got Coeddil, Durthu, and Adonhu in that order of age. Adonhu is the oldest and the wisest, with the gift of foresight. Durthu is, brave and fearless, and Coeddil is supposed to be cunning. So these three elder treemen, elder tree lords, as it were, are essentially the ones that curate and constantly monitor, and they're always tending to Athalloran and the world roots. And from there, we get the presence of the elves, who learn to tap into the world roots and traverse them, and they eventually end up in Athalloran with some of the colonists from Ulthuan. Now, we know the great story between the Dark Elves and the High Elves and the Dwarfs and everything, and how that relationship eventually actually creates the Wood Elves, right? These kind of Ulthuan refugees that decide to stay in Athalloran. And there is a really big conflict between Adonhu and Coeddil between whether or not the elves can stay. Coeddil does not want them to take up residence in Athalloran. He looks at them as interlopers. He looks at them as despoilers. Whereas Durthu, the person who actually triggers this event, invites the elves into Athalloran to protect them from the dwarfs. And Adonhu actually comes to the aid, or at least the side of Durthu in his wise counsel, and says, listen, these elves are more important for the future than you can conceive right now, Coeddil. We have to let them into Athalloran. And the reason I'm not reading directly from an 8th edition book or anything like that is because, for the most part, the story of these three elder treemen is told amongst a number of other stories. So I'm basically paraphrasing all this stuff together for you guys. Now, Coeddil eventually kind of, I don't want to say that he becomes allies with the elves, because he doesn't. He is still very much about the forest spirits, the other treemen, the dryad, all this. He really, for the most part, doesn't want anything to do with the elves. He has a very hands-off type approach. They're over there, we're over here. And for the longest time, the forest spirits actually never appear before the wood elves. For the most part, they kind of stay reserved and away from them. And it's not until we get an invasion into Athalloran by the Beastmen that Coeddil actually rallies to defend the forest. Now, of course, he's not defending the wood elves, he's defending the forest. Morgher Shadowgrave comes to the forest and goes and looks to despoil it and corrupt it with all sorts of chaosy disgustingness, and Ariel rallies out to destroy him. And from this, we kind of get maybe what corrupts Coeddil, or that's at least the way the lore kind of leads you in that direction, because after the incursion by the Beastmen and the eventual fighting off of that incursion, you get Coeddil's fall from grace, what is called the Betrayal in the 8th edition army book. It's 500 years after the Battle of Anguish, in which is the large battle between Morgher and the Wood Elves. And through this, we get a point where Coeddil kind of waits until the winter, when all of the other forest spirits, when Orion has been kind of sent into his rebirth, for the most part, where things are going through a transition, and he attacks. And from there, it's this really bloody battle between the Wild Riders, who try to stave off this ability, or I'm sorry, the Coeddil and all of his handmaidens, the Dryad handmaidens, from destroying essentially the Wood Elf occupants of Athalloran. And that's just quickly paraphrased and quickly digested, because there's a lot more to it. But eventually the Mage Queen Ariel again rallies her fury and beats back Coeddil and imprisons him within the Wildwood. Now, we've heard about the Wildwood plenty of times, but the Wildwood is essentially this location in the southeastern portion of Athalloran that is sequestered away from the rest of the forest, using a number of what are they called? Waystones, to essentially create a fence, a barrier that locks away all of the particularly malicious forest spirits away from the rest. And that's where you get the Wildwood Rangers. These guys are essentially the wardens or the goalers of this location, keeping things well within its borders and away from the fence, and preventing them from being broken. Now, Coeddil then has a heavy interaction with Draika, one of the probably one of the most famous handmaidens here, the Briar Maven of Woe. And Draika goes and releases Coeddil from his cage within the Wildwood. She collects a number of artifacts across the realm and is able to blow up the Waystones and create an opening for Coeddil to exit from. And that is where we get Coeddil interacting into this DLC in some way, shape, or form. Again, we really only know what has been leaked from Blondie during the actual announcement of the game, and that's really all we know about Coeddil so far in his presence. But from what we've heard from the lore, he is this large, terrifying creature. He's not a normal Treeman in the sense that he is a big, huge branch monster. I mean, that's a given, but he is covered from head to toe in these scorch marks and everything. He is a lot different than what we usually get from the otherwise relatively benevolent look of a Treeman. So here is a little bit from Coeddil in Callard's book Grail Knight, and we also get a presence of Coeddil a lot in the Orion trilogy. But here's a really good accurate portrayal of what he looks like. Towering over them all stood a creature 50 feet tall. An ancient and twisted oak come to life, its gnarled hide blackened by fire. Roots burrowed into the earth as each immense leg came crashing down into the snow, making the ground shudder and shake, and huge branch arms capable of pounding a castle to dust swung heavily at its sides. Clusters of vindictive spikes hid within the knots and hollows that pocked its charred bark flesh, and a gaping maw filled with splinter-like teeth opened halfway up the monster's trunk. Above this vicious mouth, a pair of tiny, deep-set eyes blinked. Ancient Coeddil walks among us. Freed from the Glamour Weave's prison came Draika's voice, hissing forth from within the Oak of Ages. No fear, petty lordling mortals. The time of reckoning has come. With a booming roar, the gigantic tree lord Coeddil thrust its arms into the ground. The earth shivered and bulged as if things were burrowing beneath it, shooting towards Callard and the elven host. A heartbeat later, and a forest of roots burst up through the snow. So that kind of concludes our lore here on Coeddil, and it's not the deepest dive on him because he has a very interesting interaction in Callard's book in the Orion trilogy, and I actually haven't read the Orion trilogy. I think I perused it once upon a time, and I can't remember a ton of the Callard books because it's been so long. But that kind of concludes our lore dive onto these three subjects here. We'll get plenty of hands-on with them, like I keep saying, in the coming days as we are able to dive into those aspects of the game as the embargoes unleash. So look forward to some more content here in the coming weeks for Twisted and the Twilight. We've got some streams ahead. I've got some Is It Right For You campaign guides ahead. We're going to be doing some battles with Turin, all sorts of fun stuff here, guys. But as always, thank you so much for watching here today. Have a good one, and take care.